Thank you for asking me about my experiences in the World War II. For many years after the war, no one asked about what went on, and those of us who were there were mostly trying to forget most of it. One of the first people who showed interest in my story was Todd. And when he was 16, I took him up fishing into northern Quebec to fish for trout. And he said, "Grandpa, what did you do in the war?" And so we had a bit of a discussion there. He was absolutely fascinated, and he has been very fascinated with the story ever since, and has been involved in the continuing story in the last 3 years. As a high school student in Sault Ste. Marie Collegiate Institute, I belonged to the Air Cadets, whose activities I enjoyed very much. At the time that I was in grade 12, as David told you, I was working very hard. I got tired out and disillusioned and unhappy. And when the opportunity came to join the Air Force when I was 18, I took it. And I went to the recruiting office, had some papers signed, and took the train to North Bay, the induction center, where we went through medicals. Went back on the train and arrived in Toronto in the morning to the Manning depot there at the old exhibition ground. And our first stop was in the sheep pen there. And, we were there for a couple of weeks and got our needles and our kit and our uniform. And then we graduated to the cow pen. There was 6,000 of us in the cow pen. To make it short, I went through the British Commonwealth Air Training Plan. I don't know whether you know what that was or not, but during the war, the Allies decided that the Canadian prairies and the light-out spaces of Canada were great places to train aircrew. And so a terrific organization was set up, and there were just hundreds of bases over Canada training people in the skill of air combat. Anyway, by the spring or late winter of 1944, I found myself in Halifax with an air gunner's badge on my left chest, ready to go overseas. As an air gunner, I was co-opted, seconded to the ship's crew, and I found myself manning a big Ehrlichen machine gun on the bow of the ship, and was my duties were to watch for submarines and aircraft. Fortunately, we didn't see any because by then the submarines were pretty well under control, and so we had an uneventful trip overseas, except we had a 3-day winter storm, and we certainly got tested to see whether we were going to be seasick or not. Fortunately, I wasn't. We got to Bristol in England, and from there we were taken by train to Brighton on the south coast of England to await a position in training. Our first posting was to the Operational Training Unit 22 at Wellesmore in England near Stratford-on-Avon. There, several dozen airmen of various categories, pilots, navigators, bomb aimers, wireless operators, and air gunners, were put in a big room and said, "Crew up." So 6 men to each crew. And you would never think that it would work out, but it worked out marvelously well, and had been for some years. And I found myself designated as a tail gunner. And the aircraft that we were training on were called Wimpies. actually Wellingtons. And they were two-motor bombing planes, which had been very good aircraft, but by that time were obsolete and were being used as training planes. So we learned how to navigate around England, and we learned about the tricks of being an operational crew, and our function was dropping bombs on Germany, planting mines along the coasts, and hunting for enemies here and there. And we learned our lessons fairly quickly. And you take just a bunch of teenagers and put them together as strangers, and then in a few weeks you find that they can fly an airplane and do all these complicated sort of things. From one of our experiences there was on an exercise that they called a diversion raid. And in a diversion raid, the training craft would fly over towards Germany, and we would calculate you would be just close enough that you would excite the German fighters to come up off their drones and come after you, and you would hope to turn around and go back to England before they caught you. And then that would make the skies clear for the bombing crews to go through with the fighters already up in the air and running out of gas. However, one of them did catch us one day, and although we didn't get hurt very badly, we had some holes in our aircraft. From the OTU, we were transferred to a training unit called a heavy conversion unit. And the heavy conversion unit was in Yorkshire, England, a place called Wombleton. And the aircraft we were learning to fly was this one. However, the aircraft had been used for bombing raids for some many hours and were mostly worn out. And we were warned that they weren't very reliable, that we would have to be careful. And the figured loss on that was 17%. So, and it sort of proved to be true. However, we did the best we could, and we would learn to be knowledgeable of this big aircraft, how to handle it, how to handle the equipment, and we did a lot of navigation trips and so on. One of them was a night trip down over Wales, and we got down and flew into a thunderstorm, and suddenly we found that we were just forcibly in a downdraft downwards, and I was sure that we were going to crash because the intercom went out, and the lightning was flashing across the ends of my gun barrels in the turret. And but suddenly there was a terrific G-force when the pilot finally got the aircraft flying again, and the intercom came on, and I heard the voice say, Skipper, we're down below the tops of the mountains, you better climb a little bit. So we had a choice. We could battle the hills or climb up into the thunderstorm. So anyway, we survived that. But a couple of our crew from that flight did crash and were lost. In November 1st, 1944, we were posted to Squadron 408, known as the Goose Squadron, where our war was really starting. After a couple of weeks familiarizing ourselves with the routines, the operational aircraft, and equipment, we were ready for action. The good thing now was we were flying superb airplanes that were very reliable, and we felt quite comfortable. On November the 18th, 1944, we flew our first bombing raid on to a place called Munster, which was an industrial city. It was a daytime raid. I just forget the significance of it. But it was supposed to be a clear day, but when we got there, it was clouded over, and we had to bomb on skylights, which were hanging on flares or parachutes. And I'm not sure if we did any damage or not, but there was a lot of flak, so we must have been worried about what we were going to do. And flak appears like a black cloud like that, just a puff. And it looks very harmless until it gets close, and then there's a fire inside. It gets a little closer and you can feel it, the concussion from it. And then it gets a little closer, and we got some holes in our aircraft again. However, we got home safely from that. We had in a day or two, we had another episode where we were all loaded up with overload fuel tanks. And it looked like it was going to be a long trip. And we were all thinking Berlin. However, in the afternoon it was canceled, and these brave airmen, they were all cheering, hooray, we're not going to have to go. Then on the 21st, we were alerted in the morning that there was going to be some action that night. And as with all air raids, there was a meeting of the air crews in what's called a briefing session. These are tactical officers that go over what you're supposed to do. The weatherman tells you what to expect, and they tell you about the hazards from aircraft and so on your path. And the flight was, raid was to a place called Castroff-Rauxel in the Ruhr Valley. And it was a big oil fabrication plant. And at that time, we were concentrating on knocking out the oil-producing facilities of Germany, because this was a big plant that was supplying the Western Front. We arrived at the target on time. It was a lot of flak, and but it was a clear sky. We could see the markers that had been laid down by the pathfinders who went in beforehand and put markers on the where we were supposed to drop our bombs. As we were approaching our target, I could see that the searchlights were closing in on us. And one of the searchlights, called the master light, is a very intense bluish light, and it would get onto a target, and then the other lights would come in on it to what they called a cone. So I warned the pilot that we were going to get coned if we flew straight and level, and I advised that he take some evasive action. And it was an exercise we went through to avoid things like this. But however, we were on our bombing run, and the pilot said, "We're here to do a job. I don't want to hear from anybody except the bomb aimer until we've dropped our bombs." So we went in and we dropped our bombs, and immediately this big light just clamped on us, and the other lights came in. And it's the most intense light you can imagine. And so you can't see anything, and you lose your night vision. So it was on us for a few moments and then went out, which meant that either the anti-aircraft guns had spotted us or the fighter pilots had seen us. And very shortly I could see enough that I could see there was a fighter out on the side of our aircraft. And I got the mid-upper gunner to keep an eye on him while I was searching for others, because sometimes there was a decoy that would take your attention and somebody else would come and shoot at you. However, just after I the mid-upper gunner on this plane, tracer bullets just came up from underneath and behind. It was just like you were in traffic on the 401 with lights just going by every way. And I could see the tail planes of the aircraft, those fins on the side, just sort of disappearing. And the flight engineer came out on the intercom and said, Louis, the mid-upper gunner is bleeding badly. I'll have to get him out of the turret. And just then, we were blasted again straight from behind. And I got a terrible bang on the side of my head. And the next thing I knew, I was falling in the air. And the legs of my flying suit came out of my boots and were flapping me in the face. And I realized, gee, I'm falling. And so I pulled my ripcord, and I don't know if anybody's ever come down in a parachute or not, but it's just like somebody just gave you the worst kick in the bum you ever had. And then very shortly, I landed on top of a house, rolled off onto a cobblestone courtyard, and was winded. I landed on my back, and I thought I was dead, but it was raining, a cold rain, November 21st, and I quickly came to it, realized the situation I was in. My parachute folded over this low building, and the instructions were hide your parachute and then take off and try to get back. I couldn't get the parachute off the house, but across the valley I could see a wood. And in this little village, I couldn't see anybody around, so I headed over to this bush, and I found on the side of this hill there was a nice thick vine, and I crawled up in there to sort of figure out what I was going to do next. It was probably around 8 or 9 o'clock at night, or I just forget exactly the time. So I knew I couldn't do anything until morning anyway. I needed to get my maps, and I needed to get the compass. We had a compass in our collar button that you had to put together in the correct direction. So in the morning, as soon as it got light, I got my stuff together that I had. And I noticed the night before when I was running across this little valley to the bush, I thought my boot was full of water. And when I got there and took my boot off, it was actually full of blood. I had a wound in the side of my head, and I guess the blood had run down into my boot. So anyway, for there were people all around and dogs barking and so on, so I knew I couldn't go out in the daytime, so I waited till night. And for the next week, I wandered around trying to find my way up to Arnhem, where the front was. I could hear the artillery up there and so on. And but it was cloudy and raining and snowing and freezing. So and the compass is just a little button, and you were trying to be in the dark so on, and maybe trying to get a light to see where you were going. I don't know whether I wandered around in circles or what happened, but I probably only walked about 10 or 12 miles. And so I was played out, and there was a farmer's barn came up, it looked very inviting, and I went into the barn, and I thought I could get some rest in the hay, maybe even find some food like chop for the pigs or something that I could eat, because I hadn't had much to eat. But anyway, the morning came, and the farmer came to the barn, and he had a big dog. the dog found me right away. The jig was up, so I didn't know what to expect. But he was obviously very frightened. He was more frightened of me than I was of him. But I assured him I wasn't going to hurt him, and so he invited me and signaled for me to go to the house. So I followed him into his house, and there were two teenage girls there and his wife. And the girls took my outer clothes off, and they had a stove there, and they dried my clothes, and they gave me a wonderful breakfast, eggs and toast and so on. But of course, the authorities showed up very soon, either a policeman or a member of the German army, and he had a few words with the farmer, and he sort of had a wire handcuff thing that he put on me and around his waist, and indicated that I was to follow him. He had a bicycle and I was on foot. So he was very professional, not friendly, not hostile, just he had a job to do, and didn't treat me unkindly, and didn't paddle the bike too hard. I was able to keep up to him, and we went into a police station, and I was there for a few hours, and then an Air Force officer came along from the Luftwaffe, and he told me that we were going to go to Frankfurt on Main, where the prisoner of war camp was. And they had a motor vehicle take me with a guard to the station. We got on a train for Frankfurt. The train was very crowded, but the way we went, and on the way to Frankfurt, an American Thunderbolt, which was a tactical fighter plane, strafed us, and just there was wood and pieces flying everywhere, and he knocked the motor out. On the locomotive, the steam engine blew, and we had all dived off the train, of course, and for a minute the guard had lost me, but he quickly found me, and I was very glad because the crowd turned quite hostile, and I was very frightened because they recognized me as an airman, and why wouldn't they be hostile? However, we got back on the train and got to Frankfurt at the station, and then to a little place called Oberrussel. But at the station at Frankfurt, a riot of women sort of were very menacingly and shouting and threatening, and I was quite frightened. But he backed me up into a corner, pulled out his gun, and yelled a few orders, and the Germans are quite disciplined people, and so they backed off, and we were all right. Then I was taken to the prison camp and put in a cell, which is the usual small cell, 8 by 6, and with a board bed and one thin gray blanket and a lavatory can. And I was left there and the door clanged shut. And on the wall I noticed there were score marks, you know, the 4 marks and stroke through it. And there were various series of these from, well, maybe a dozen to 85 and so on. And you would count them and say, I wonder what they were. I wonder if somebody was in here that long. But anyway, the next morning, I was taken to a room with 2 interrogators in it. They wanted to know where I was and where I'd come from and so on. And I reminded them the Geneva Convention said the only thing that I was allowed to tell them was my name, rank, and number. And they said, yeah, but we can't attach you to any craft, so we don't know whether you're really a downed airman or not. Maybe you're a spy, and if we find out you're a spy, we're going to shoot you. And we had been told that they would go through this routine with you and not to worry about it, but it is a little disconcerting, just to say. I was interrogated over a period of about a week or 10 days, and they used the various techniques. They'd nearly freeze you, and then they'd turn the heat up, and you'd be roasting, and they'd put the cover over the little window, and it would be dark, and you wouldn't know, and you'd be there for hours and hours. And you weren't allowed to talk, to shout or anything, but there was lots of noises, and there was sounds of people crying, and there was, you would wonder if somebody was getting beaten up, and all sorts of these psychological noises. The last interrogation was by a couple of Gestapo, and they said, now your time has run out, and we still don't know where you came from. So as far as we're concerned, you're a spy, and you just about had it. So anyway, what could I do? I didn't know anything. They wanted to know something called Village Inn. What is this thing called Village Inn? I didn't know. Didn't have a clue. Matter of fact, I didn't have a clue about anything. But I found out afterwards, just a couple of years ago, that it was a device that they had on the Lancasters for the air gunners to shoot much more accurately. But I didn't know what it was then. Anyway, suddenly they came and said, well, you're through. We're going to send you to a segregation camp at Wetzlar. And at Wetzlar, we got on the train and went to Wetzlar. And that was where there were Americans, there were British, Australians, Polish, and they were sorting you out to go to different camps. There was the first time I had to change of clothes for 2 weeks, and so it was. And they did give us a cold shower, and some kind of rough soap, and so on. So, and we discarded our clothes, which were pretty well wrecked, and I got an American uniform from the American Red Cross. Just an ordinary uniform with a greatcoat. So I felt pretty good. And I met the pilot of our aircraft was there. And I had wondered what had happened to our crew, because the tail gunner was always supposed to be the one that was killed. And there I was, relatively unharmed, except for a cut on the side of my head and some exposure problems. But he said everybody got out of the aircraft, but there were only he and I were alive. So that was a great blow, because in a group like that, you get very close to each other, and you have a great comradeship. And especially one chap from Peace River, Louis Bassarab, who was the other gunner. And we had had so much fun that summer in England. We got to be the greatest pals. And he was the one that had been bleeding in the aircraft, but he was dead. From Wetzlar, we were to go to our permanent prisoner of war camp. We didn't hope it was going to be too permanent, but it was one. And being a British NCO, I was sent to a segregation or isolation camp down in Lower Silesia, which is about 90 miles west of Krakow in Poland. Down right now where Auschwitz is located. And we got on the boxcars, a crowded boxcar, and we were low priority, so we spent a lot of time just waiting for other trains to pass. But just as we were getting into a city called Kassel, K-A-S-S-E-L, which was a big railway yard, the RAF came over with their bombs. And the guards locked the doors and away they went. And if you've ever been near an explosion, just for an hour, just one explosion after another, and the old boxcar was bouncing up and down. And we didn't know whether the next one was going to fall on us. But anyway, the guards came back after a few hours, and they were surprised that we were still alive. But so they said that they couldn't move us on that boxcar. They'd have to take us out to where there was a free track. And so we trekked across the town of Kassel, which was really smashed up with bombing raid. And there was a team of horses dead on the side of the road that had got killed by the bombs. I don't know what happened to the driver. I guess he'd been picked up by the ambulance. But anyway, we made our way on to a place called Bangkow, number 7, Stalag 7B. And there were 1,500 British non-commissioned officer aircrew and 160 Irish guards who had been captured in North Africa 5 years before. And in this camp, the internal organization was run by the prisoners themselves, and it was an amazing organization. And they looked after the distribution of the miserable rations that we had, and they had chess clubs and drama clubs, music clubs. There were prisoners who were professors, had been professors in universities, and they gave courses in various disciplines that were recognized after the war by universities. And it was just before Christmas, and they put on an amazing Christmas concert with costumes, and the prisoners were dressed up as women and men, and some of them were pretty good looking too. And so we got through Christmas. For Christmas dinner, our meat menu was horse, and it was good too. Very nice. But the Russian front was coming, and in January we were warned that we would probably not be allowed to be overtaken by the Russians, because the Germans even then were planning at the end of the war they were going to use us as bargaining pawns. So as the Russians were approaching, they told us that we had to be ready at any moment to force march to get across the Oder River to the west so that the bridges could be demolished. So on January the 18th, in the middle of the night, we were all given that cry that we heard so often, "Rouse, rouse!" And it was a blinding snowstorm, and out we went with our really rather inadequate clothing and temperatures down 25, 30 below zero. And we were marched to the west. And I wasn't too bad because I hadn't been a prisoner very long, so I didn't have the nutritional deficiencies that these other older prisoners had. And but we were on the road for 150 miles, and we were there for 3 weeks. I think about February the 12th, we got to the end of where we walked. And one night when we were heading for the final one to cross the bridge, it was 30 below zero, and it was an absolute blizzard. There was a high wind and snow. Just something like I've never even seen in Canada. And we walked 30 miles. And at the end of that, we figured about a third of our lunch weren't there anymore, as if they had fallen on the side of the road and frozen to death. We got across the Oder River, and we went to this, they stopped at this communal barn and village. You know how those communes are in Eastern Europe. And so we got to sleep in the barn. And this was the best accommodation we had, but because before then we would be sleeping in open sheds and so on in this cold weather, and we survived by huddling up and having communal warmth.